So in this next video, I'm going to go over some code that I wrote that shows you how to write objects in JavaScript, object graphs in JavaScript, using JavaScript Object Notation, otherwise known as Json. And I'm going to show you the difference between two different approaches in creating object graphs. One using a standard approach with JavaScript, and another using an approach with Json, and showing you that they produce the exact same results. If you look at week 7 in GitHub, so I'm looking at my local copy here, but this is an exact mirror image of what we have in GitHub, so I'm just going to close this. If you go into the simple JSON example folder, so this is a really simple project here. I have one HTML file. All I have is two divs. Both of them are tagged as a button so that I can grab both of them at the same time if I want, but they also have the class of button1 and button2 just in case I want to grab them individually. So notice up here, as usual, I'm linking my scripts file, my styles file, and jQuery. So all I have is two divs, very simple. That's the jQuery file. You can link to that remotely, but sometimes I like to just put the file in my local. And my styles is nothing important. I just made some styles to make the buttons look interesting. And if I open it up, those are basically those two divs that I have. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So now we have the JavaScript, and that is what I'm going to be talking about here. So I'm going to have you scroll all the way to the bottom at the beginning. And notice that here I'm doing some jQuery when the document loads that's no different from anything we've done so far. So I'm binding 4 events. First of all, I'm binding an event to every item that is tagged as button, which means both of those buttons, because each one of those has the button class on it. So this says for any item that has the button class on it, which is both buttons, I want you to bind this function to the mouse over event. And what that does is grab the thing that I clicked on and change the CSS border property to pick solid line. And I do the same thing, the only difference is this is the mouse over binding and this is the mouse out binding. So I'm grabbing both buttons and I'm binding when I mouse over to change the border to lime, and when I mouse out to change the border back to black. So this code right here is really the same as what we were doing in the jQuery lectures. And just to show you it happening, you can see as I hover over them, and let me expand this DOM over here, you can see as I hover over them, the style is changing, and you can see the DOM changing as it highlights it over there in the inspect element window. So that's what those two lines of code do. And now, also, this is similar to what we've been doing before. I've said, in this case, I've said don't bind to all buttons. This I just want to bind to button 1, and this I just want to bind to button 2 when I click on them. So when I click on each one of these, it's going to execute the code inside the function. So, for example, if I commented this out here, and I just say alert button 2 clicked, and here I said alert button 1 clicked, just to prove that those bindings are working. Oops. Alert button 1 clicked. Oopsie, I missed a parentheses. So when I click on that one, it says button 1 clicked. When I click on that one, it says button 2 clicked. So now that we have our setup, we can get into the code that I actually want to demonstrate here. So first, I want to talk about this function right here, create team as object. So I'm going to scroll up to that. So for those of you, the prerequisite to this class is the introduction to web development, front-end web development, and so none of this should be new to you. And if it is, I would suggest really digging into the W3 Schools lectures, because this is really basic object creation in JavaScript. And we did this also, we reviewed this in week 3 of this class. So there should be no surprises here. So all I'm doing here is I'm creating an object graph. So I create a team, and as you can see, the last line of code says return the team. So this function is doing nothing but creating a team. So I create the team, and since JavaScript is a dynamic language, I can just throw properties onto it. So by doing team.city, I'm creating a string that is a property of the team and giving it the value of Cleveland. And when I say team.name equals Cavaliers, I'm creating another property, which is a string property on the team, and I'm giving it the value of Cavaliers. So when those 3 lines of code are done executing, I'll have an object called team that will have 2 string properties, one Cleveland and one Cavaliers. So before I even do anything, I just want to remind you about the debugging aspect of Google Chrome. So if I wanted to show you in the debugger what I just talked about, and this is really important. I know it's kind of a pain, and most people are lazy and don't want to debug, and they just say, oh, my code doesn't work, what do I do? A lot of your questions are going to be answered if you debug into it. So I'll show you what I'm talking about here once again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click the button 1, and it's going to invoke create team as object, and I'm going to put a debug statement right here on the 3rd line to show what is happening in memory when that happens. So to do that, come in here, we go to sources, and we go to scripts. That's where my code is. So I'm just going to move that a little bit over here. And I'm going to go to where I was just talking about, create team as object, and I'm going to put a breakpoint on line 29. So as soon as it executes 25, 26, and 27, that will be done, and I will check out in memory what I've just done. So now when I click on example 1, it should hit the breakpoint on line 29. So there we are, we're paused on line 29, and you can even see up here that it's kind of showing right in line in the sources window what my object looks like. But even better, I want to come down here to scope, and I want to look at team, which is of type object. And if I expand that team, you can see it has a string property of city, which has the value of Cleveland, and a name, which has the string value of Cavaliers. So as we go through this, and as you go through this on your own, if you find that you're trying to access something that you expect to be there, but it's telling you it's undefined, you try alerting it, it's undefined, make sure you debug it and come in to the window in the debug tools here to verify that the memory actually contains the values that you expect. So, instead of throwing up your hands and saying, oh, this isn't working, I don't understand, you should really try to make an effort to debug into it and figure out what's there, and that will lead you to, hopefully, the solution as to why it's not there. So having said that, let's continue on here with the code, and take note that, again, this function is just trying to create an object. Now what I do here is I create 3 other objects that have nothing to do with team. Notice I don't say team anywhere in this code that I've highlighted. I'm creating an object called LeBron. LeBron has a first name, a last name, and a number. And similarly, I'm creating 2 other objects that also have first names, last names, and numbers. Now what I do is I go to the team and I say .roster equals new array, and I pass LeBron, Kyrie, and Love. So at this point, I expect these 3 objects to be respectively the 0th, the 1st, and the 2nd object inside of an array on the team called roster. So I'll debug that by putting a breakpoint right here, and I'll look at my whole team. So I'll come back here, and I'll go to my scripts, sources, scripts, expand this again, and when I get way down there, I expect to see my whole team filled up with all the objects. Click example 1, I'm down at the bottom, so now if I expand my team here, I see Cleveland and Cavaliers, but I also see a roster, which is an array of 3 items. Expand that. You can see object 0, object 1, and object 2. Expand each one of those, and of course I can see my 3 players inside of there with their first name, last name, and numbers. So again, this shouldn't be anything new. This is simple JavaScript object creation. And the purpose of that, what I just showed you, is to contrast it with what we're about to do in JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and close this for a second. So this whole function here, create team as object, just creates the team. And then what we do after that is call this function display the team and pass it along. And this is a function at the very top of the file that I wrote. Oops. That just kind of proves that the object worked. So it says, oh, give me a team, and I'll show you what their name is, what their city is, and at first it shows the team roster first player, first name, last name, and number. As an example, once again, of how to access a single position of an array, and then I wrote a for loop that iterates through the array based on the size of the array. At each iteration of the array, it'll pull out the current player, and then I do an alert to show the players all their information. So it should say like number 23, LeBron James. And it'll do that for every player on the team. So all in all, nothing new there. It should work just fine, and let me actually let it go through and run its course. So I'm going to go ahead and click example 1. It says Cleveland Cavaliers, LeBron James, 23, and now we're inside of the for loop, number 23 LeBron James, number 2 Kyrie Irving, and number 0 Kevin Love. So that all works, and again, it's nothing new. That's a combination of jQuery and just creating normal JavaScript objects. So now we get on to the JSON example. And notice the only thing different between the button 1 click and button 2 click is that instead of calling this function create team as object, I'm calling create team as JSON. And I'm going to call display team the same exact function that I called before. The only difference is the team that I'm creating and passing to the display function is created in a different way. So this is my create team as JSON function. And you can see that you can see right away, without even looking at the details, that the structure is exactly the same as the object that I created before. I have an object that has a city, a name, and a roster. So those are the 3 aspects of the object. And inside of roster, I have 3 items, which are the 3 players. And each player has a first name, a last name, and a number. So you can see very clearly that conceptually this is the same object as what we created right here, except it, I think, looks a lot better. It's probably easier to read. So having said that, it's clear that we're really creating the same object. We're just doing it in a different way. And that's really important to understand about JSON. And if you examine what the acronym means, JavaScript Object Notation, the N being very important, notation, it's just another way of creating an object graph in JavaScript. There's no difference at all in what this code produces and what this code produces. They will produce the exact same results. So that's the key to understanding the code that you're looking at here. This code, create team as object, will produce the exact same result as the JavaScript object notation approach. And the reason that JSON is better isn't just because it's easier to read. It's because this here is script that has to be executed in order to construct the object graph. Whereas this here, from here to here, this is basically where the object, or the JSON notation starts and ends. That can be sent as a string across the network from a client to a server, or from a server to a client, or across anything, and then after the fact just be turned into an object. So it's a little more portable. You can transport it across the network and then boom, create a big object graph out of it. It's not a series of instructions. It's an object notation. So JSON is much more preferable, not just because it's readable, but because you can transport it and represent data between two different systems. And then, so the last thing really to understand is just the details of the JSON, which I covered in the first video, but let's look at the details here. So once again, the object notation starts and ends with a begin and end curly brace, and you have a comma delimited list of name-value pairs. So let me start splitting these up a little here. This is the first name-value pair. Obviously, it's just a string and a string. So here's the first comma. That means that we have another property, another name-value pair. So here's the second name-value pair. It's very similar to the first, and again followed by a comma. And then here is the third name-value pair. And notice that there's no comma after the third name-value pair because it's the last one. So no comma after the last one. Whenever you have a comma-delimited list of name-value pairs, the last item doesn't have a comma after it because there's nothing after it. In this case, the name of the name-value pair is just a simple string roster, but the value is that. It begins with a open bracket and ends with an open end bracket, which that means an array. So in JavaScript Object Notation, the brackets enclose an array. So what you would expect to see inside of an open bracket and a closed bracket is a comma delimited list of JSON objects, which is these three things here. And notice again the commas. There's a comma after the first object, a comma after the second object, but no comma after the last object. And once you start looking at these objects, you basically start over with your thinking about JSON. Inside of the begin and end curly brace for each one of these objects, it's just a collection of name-value pairs. And if you look at these three, these are just strings, name, value, comma, name, value, comma, name, value, and no comma after the last one. So you kind of have to do a little bit of recursive thinking. You look at that as one object. Inside of the object, it's a comma delimited list of name value pairs where the last element doesn't have a comma after it. And when you blow that thinking up, here you have again a list of three JavaScript objects, comma delimited with no comma after the last item. And those are inside of an array, which is one value, which happens to be the value of roster. So this becomes the third name value pair in your entire enclosing JSON object. So I kind of added spaces here to make it more easy to read, but usually you'll see in the real world you see it looking like this. Because most programmers are pretty darn good at reading JSON, so they try to condense this as much as possible. So you'll probably see something, it might even be more condensed than this, but I would never condense it any more than this. Let's see here. It's kind of hard because I'm trying to think of like all the people I know and how they format their JSON, and different people have different styles. But I think, let me take a look at this. So certainly people do that. I think at the very least you'll see people condensing it to that effect. Once in a while you'll see people doing something like that. I don't know. But in general, whenever you have trouble reading something, you can just add the spaces yourself. Usually if I'm trying to read some JSON that somebody else wrote and I don't understand it, I do exactly that. I start blowing it up. I start putting spaces in between the items to make it easier to read. Do some more extra indentation. Like I would probably indent this whole thing like I just did. But that's pretty much it. So I'm going to not save that because I don't know if I messed anything up. But if I reopen it again and I look at it just as it was before, so just to prove that this object is exactly the same, I'm going to go back to my example. I'm going to reload it. I'm going to click example 2 and you'll see the same exact information: Cleveland Cavaliers, LeBron James 23, and the 3 players. And to double prove it, I'm going to put a debug statement on sources. So at the end here, you know what, I'll do it down here. in button 2 click after I create the team as JSON, I'm just going to check it out right there on line 107. So I'm going to click example 2 this time, and notice the team that I get back, Cleveland Cavaliers with an array of 3 people, and of course the objects inside are exactly the same as we saw before. So once again, there's no difference in the results. The difference is you have a more readable, more transportable, much more powerful and versatile method of creating the same exact information. So that's pretty much it. I want you to definitely be able to understand JavaScript Object Notation after reading this video, because if there's any confusion going forward, you really have to have a mastery of this syntax in the next couple of weeks, because we're going to start doing client-server interaction, and if you don't understand being able to read and construct JSON, you're not going to be able to do it at all. So I would spend some extra time looking at this simple JSON example and making sure that you have it absolutely mastered and completely understand. And as always, if you have any questions, please post them on Blackboard. I and the other students will respond to you and clear up any questions you might have. All right, thanks.